across the United States. Long after the end of slavery, a powerful and often overlooked story began to unfold. In places like Oklahoma, Florida, Illinois, Arkansas, and New York, black communities did far more than survive. They built. They created towns where black-owned businesses lined the streets, where schools educated the next generation, where doctors, lawyers, teachers, and entrepreneurs served their own people, and where land ownership represented something once thought impossible: independence. These were not isolated success stories. They were living proof that, when given even a small window of opportunity, black Americans transformed hardship into progress. From bustling commercial districts to peaceful residential neighborhoods, these communities embodied hope, dignity, and self-determination. Some produced oil, others controlled farmland, trade, or skilled labor. Together, they formed a quiet but powerful challenge to the idea that prosperity had only one face. But history rarely tells this part of the story in full. What happened next was not accidental. These cities did not fade away with time. They were erased through violence, displacement, false accusations, destructive policies, and deliberate neglect. Wealth built over decades vanished in days. Families were scattered, futures were interrupted, and the silence that followed became part of the injustice itself. This story is not just about loss. It is about truth, about understanding how the past continues to shape the present. Because to understand today's inequality, we must first confront yesterday's destruction. In this video, we will revisit 10 prosperous black cities that once stood as symbols of progress and uncover how and why they were destroyed. Their stories matter, not only as history, but as lessons that still echo today. If you believe these stories deserve to be remembered, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others. Your support helps keep these untold histories alive. What makes these stories so haunting is not only the prosperity that once existed, but the pattern that followed it. After black communities proved they could build thriving cities, the response was often swift and unforgiving. The success that should have been celebrated instead drew hostility, fear, and resentment. These cities did not collapse from within. They were pushed toward destruction by forces that operated both in the open and behind the scenes, turning opportunity into vulnerability. In many places, the first signs appeared as whispers and rumors, carefully planted and quickly spread. A false accusation, an exaggerated headline, or a claim of disorder was often enough to ignite fear. That fear then justified violence. Mobs formed, sometimes within hours, targeting homes, businesses, churches, and schools. Streets that had once echoed with commerce and community life were reduced to silence as buildings were looted or burned, not because they posed a threat, but because they stood as evidence of black achievement. Yet violence alone does not fully explain what happened. In some cities, destruction came through neglect rather than flames. Local authorities looked away as chaos unfolded, refusing protection or intervention when it was most needed. In other cases, the very institutions meant to uphold the law became active participants. Arrests were made without cause, entire neighborhoods were placed under control, and survivors were detained or forced to leave, unable to return to the land they had worked so hard to claim. The message was clear: prosperity could be built, but it would not be allowed to last. There were also moments when destruction arrived with official approval, wrapped in legal language and presented as progress. Entire communities were cleared under the banner of development, public safety, or urban improvement. Families who owned their homes were displaced through policies that offered little protection and even less fairness. What was lost was more than property. Generations of stability, education, and economic growth disappeared, replaced by uncertainty and forced migration. As these cities fell, so did the wealth they had created. Businesses that supported local economies vanished overnight. Savings accumulated over decades were wiped away. Children who had grown up surrounded by role models and opportunity were suddenly cut off from both. The impact did not end with those who were forced to flee. It carried forward into the lives of their descendants, shaping access to housing, education, and financial security in ways that are still felt today. What connects all of these stories is not just tragedy, but intention. The repeated nature of these events across different states and decades reveals a troubling consistency. Whenever Black communities reached a level of independence that challenged existing power structures, that success was treated as a problem to be solved. Destruction became a tool, whether through open violence, silent neglect, or policy-driven removal. Understanding this history brings the earlier story into sharper focus. The prosperity of these cities was real, earned, and deeply rooted. Their destruction was not inevitable, nor was it accidental. It was the result of choices made by individuals, institutions, and governments. And until those choices are acknowledged, the silence surrounding these lost cities continues to shape the present, leaving behind unanswered questions about justice, memory, and what might have been. Among all the cities whose stories were silenced, Tulsa stands apart, not because it was the only one, but because it revealed the pattern with devastating clarity. By 1921, Greenwood was not merely a neighborhood. It was a symbol of what Black self-determination looked like when it was allowed to grow, lined with offices, shops, hotels, theaters, and professional services. Greenwood had earned the name Black Wall Street through discipline, cooperation, and vision. Wealth circulated within the community. Children saw success modeled daily, and dignity was reinforced by ownership rather than permission. Greenwood did not rise quietly. Its success was visible, undeniable, and unsettling to those who believed prosperity was a privilege reserved for only one group. What made the district powerful was also what made it vulnerable. In a society already strained by racial hierarchy, Greenwood's prosperity challenged long-standing assumptions about who was entitled to wealth, safety, and permanence. That challenge did not go unanswered. The spark that led to Tulsa's destruction followed a familiar script. An allegation, never proven, quickly grew into outrage. Rumors hardened into justification, and justification turned into action. Within hours, what had taken decades to build was placed in danger. The city that had once represented possibility became a battlefield of fear and resentment, not because Greenwood posed a threat, but because its existence contradicted a deeply rooted narrative. As violence unfolded, protection failed to arrive. Homes were entered, businesses were destroyed, and entire blocks were reduced to ruins. Families fled with nothing but what they could carry, watching the physical proof of their hard work disappear behind them. By the time the destruction ended, Greenwood lay in ashes, and thousands who had once lived in stability were suddenly without shelter, income, or security. What had been one of the most prosperous Black communities in the nation was left unrecognizable. The aftermath revealed a second injustice, quieter but just as damaging. Survivors were not met with restoration or accountability. Instead, many were detained, displaced, or prevented from rebuilding. Insurance claims were denied, assistance was minimal, and responsibility was carefully avoided. The loss was not only immediate but generational. Businesses that might have employed grandchildren never reopened. Property that could have anchored families for decades was gone. The economic momentum Greenwood had created was abruptly reversed. Yet Tulsa's story does not end with destruction alone. It also exposes how memory can be controlled. For years, what happened in Greenwood was minimized, mischaracterized, certain, or omitted altogether. Silence became another layer of harm, allowing the narrative to fade while the consequences remained, without acknowledgement. Thus the damage lingered in housing gaps, economic disparities. For some days, and unresolved trauma passed quietly from one generation to the next. When viewed within the broader history of black cities across the United States, Tulsa is not an exception. It is a focal point. It brings into sharp focus the earlier patterns of prosperity followed by targeted collapse, and it prepares us to understand the stories that follow. Greenwood shows what was possible, what was lost, and what was deliberately taken away. Its destruction was not the failure of a community, but the result of a society unwilling to accept black success on its own terms. Remembering Tulsa is essential not because it stands alone, but because it connects all the threads that run through this history. It reminds us that behind every burned building and displaced family was a future that had already begun, and a city that proved, beyond doubt, that progress was never the problem. As the story moves beyond places like Greenwood, it becomes clear that destruction did not always arrive with firestorms or mass crowds. In many cases, it took quieter, more calculated forms, ones that carried the weight of authority and legality while leaving equally deep scars. These methods were less visible in the moment, but no less devastating in their long-term effects. They reveal how the dismantling of black communities evolved over time, adapting to new eras while preserving the same outcome. In Philadelphia, the threat did not come from a distant mob, but from the very institutions tasked with public safety. In a residential black neighborhood, force was applied in a way that defied the expectations of peace and protection. What followed was not only the loss of life, but the destruction of an entire community space. Homes that had sheltered families for years were reduced to emptiness, and neighbors who once shared daily routines were scattered without a clear path forward. The aftermath exposed a painful truth. When authority turns destructive, recovery becomes nearly impossible, because accountability is often delayed or denied. Further south, in Anniston, Alabama, the harm unfolded slowly, almost invisibly. Without Tulsa, there were no sudden evacuations or burning streets. Instead, the danger seeped into the soil and water over decades. Black neighborhoods bore the brunt of industrial contamination, while warnings were ignored and responsibility deferred. Families raised children unaware that the environment surrounding them was quietly undermining their health. Illness became common, opportunities diminished. And property values collapsed. Even when wrongdoing was later acknowledged, the remedies fell short of restoring what had been lost. A community weakened by sickness and economic decline was left to endure the consequences long after the source of harm had faded from public attention. In New York, the destruction came with legal signatures rather than sirens. Seneca Village stood as a rare space of stability and ownership for black families in the 19th century, offering safety, education, and political voice in a city that often denied all three. Yet its success stood in the way of a grand urban vision. Through legal authority, the land was taken, residents were displaced, and a community that had flourished for decades was erased almost entirely from memory. Progress moved forward, but only after removing those who had already built a life there. What was presented as development carried a hidden cost paid by those who had the least power to resist. These stories connect directly to the earlier chapters of prosperity and loss. They show that even when violence became less overt, the results remained consistent, whether through force, neglect, contamination, or law. Black communities were repeatedly stripped of stability and future growth. Each method differed in appearance, but all achieved the same end: displacement, diminished opportunity, and the erasure of hard-earned progress. Together, these examples deepen our understanding of how destruction was not limited to a single era or method. It adapted to its surroundings, taking on the language of safety, industry, and progress. By linking these quieter forms of harm to the more visible tragedies already discussed, a clearer picture emerges. The loss of black cities was not only a story of sudden catastrophe, but also one of prolonged exposure to decisions that slowly unraveled communities from the inside out. Recognizing these patterns helps unify the narrative. Prosperity was built through resilience and cooperation, and it was undone through systems that rarely acknowledged the damage they caused. The destruction of black communities did not always announce itself loudly, but its impact was just as permanent, leaving behind absences that still shape the landscape today. When the smoke cleared and the streets fell silent, the damage did not end with ruined buildings or displaced families. The true cost revealed itself slowly, unfolding across decades and generations. What was taken from these communities was not only land or businesses, but the foundation upon which future stability depends. Wealth that could have been passed down was erased. Health was compromised, political voice was weakened, and the sense of permanence that allows families to plan beyond survival was stripped away. For many families, the destruction marked a sudden break in their trajectory. Property ownership, once a rare and powerful foothold, vanished overnight. Homes that could have appreciated in value, businesses that might have expanded, and savings that could have funded education or entrepreneurship were all lost at once. With no assets to rebuild from, survivors were forced to start again under far harsher conditions, often in unfamiliar cities where opportunity was limited and discrimination was entrenched. The gap created in that moment did not close with time. It widened. Health followed a similar pattern. In places where communities were displaced or exposed to long-term environmental harm, physical well-being became another casualty. Families already under stress faced illness without access to adequate care or resources. Children grew up in environments shaped by instability, where housing was temporary and safety uncertain. These conditions did not simply affect one generation, they influenced life expectancy, educational outcomes, and emotional well-being for those who came after. The past settled quietly into the present, shaping daily life in ways that were often invisible but deeply felt. Political power was also diminished. Many of these communities had achieved something rare: collective influence. Through land ownership, voting rights, and organized local leadership, they had begun to shape decisions that affected their lives. When cities were destroyed or populations scattered, that influence dissolved. Voting blocs disappeared. Representation weakened. The ability to advocate for fair treatment faded as communities were broken apart and absorbed into places where their voices carried less weight. This loss made it easier for future injustices to occur, unchallenged and unchecked. Stability, perhaps the most fragile element of all, proved hardest to recover. Stability allows families to think in generations rather than days. It supports education, long-term planning, and community investment. Once broken, it is not easily restored. Families forced into constant movement struggled to rebuild trust in institutions that had failed them. Neighborhoods became temporary rather than permanent. The sense of belonging that anchors identity and purpose was replaced by uncertainty. These accumulated losses form a direct line to the inequalities seen today. Disparities in housing access, interactions with the justice system, and economic mobility did not emerge in isolation. They grew out of specific moments when progress was interrupted and erased. When wealth is removed generation after generation, opportunity becomes uneven by design. When health is compromised early, potential narrows. When political voice is weakened, policy reflects that imbalance. What makes this history especially important is that it challenges the idea that present-day inequality is the result of individual failure or lack of effort. The communities discussed earlier had already demonstrated discipline, cooperation, and success. Their setbacks were not caused by absence of ambition, but by forces that actively dismantled what they had built. Understanding this context reframes the conversation, shifting it from blame to accountability and from myth to reality. As these stories converge, a clearer picture emerges. The destruction of black cities was not only about what was lost in the moment, but about what was prevented from ever existing. The businesses never opened, the inheritances never passed down, the political influence never fully realized. These absences continue to shape the present, reminding us that inequality is not an accident of history, but the result of choices whose effects are still unfolding today. As these histories come into focus, the story does not end with destruction or loss. It continues through the voices of survivors and descendants who refuse to let silence be the final chapter. Figures like Dr. Tiffany Crutcher represent more than personal grief. They embody a broader demand for truth, recognition, and responsibility. Tulsa. Their message is not rooted in resentment, but in clarity. What was taken was real, the harm was measurable, and the consequences are still present. For descendants of destroyed communities, reparations are not about revisiting the past for its own sake. They are about acknowledging documented wrongs and addressing their lasting impact. When cities were erased, wealth disappeared, families were displaced, and opportunities were denied across generations. Structural reform, in this context, becomes a means of repair. It asks institutions to confront their roles, correct ongoing inequities, and ensure that similar patterns are not repeated under new names or policies. Dr. Crutcher's advocacy draws a direct line between history and the present. She reminds us that the systems which failed black communities in the past continue to influence justice, policing, housing, and economic access today. Her call is grounded in evidence, lived experience, and the belief that accountability is essential for healing. Justice, as she and many others argue, cannot exist without acknowledgement, and acknowledgement cannot be meaningful without action. This closing chapter invites reflection rather than accusation. It asks listeners to consider how history shapes outcomes, and how progress requires honesty about what has already occurred. Remembering these cities is not about reopening wounds, but about understanding why they never fully healed. It is about recognizing that resilience alone cannot overcome structural harm without support, reform, and fairness. The stories shared throughout this journey reveal a truth that is often overlooked. Black communities repeatedly demonstrated the ability to build, thrive, and contribute. Insight. Their setbacks were not the result of failure, but of interference. Addressing that interference, past and present, is a necessary step toward a more just future. Thank you for taking the time to listen, to reflect, and to engage with these stories. If you found this video meaningful, please consider liking it and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps ensure that these histories are not forgotten and that conversations like this continue to reach those willing to learn and understand.